The body on the table had 6 eyes, and all 6 were closed. His name was Dean. He was a Theran, one of the insect-like people from the Cold Rim worlds, known for their layered exoskeletons and their complicated insides. He had been pulled from the wreckage of a scout vessel 40 minutes ago, after it had clipped an asteroid at full speed. The emergency team had done everything right. They had stabilized his transport pod. They had gotten him aboard the galactic medical vessel Serathon in record time. They had laid him on the best treatment table in the best medical bay in this sector of space. And then the 3 best medics in that same sector had looked at his readings and gone very quiet. Doctor Sorvin was the first to speak. He was Veldari, tall, pale-skinned, with long fingers built for precision work. He had been a chief medical officer for 30 years. He had seen things that would make other species faint. He looked at the data wall, looked at the patient, and said, in a calm and measured voice, "No treatment is possible." Nurse Prex made a small sound. She was Kathy, short, dark-eyed, soft-spoken, and she had worked beside Sorvin long enough to know that when he said something like that, he meant it. But she still moved to Dean's side and adjusted the fluid line running into his upper limb. She was not ready to stop. Not yet. The third medic, a visiting specialist named Galt, pulled up the simulation model on his datapad. He ran it twice. Then he set the pad down. 3 organ clusters ruptured, he said. Neural lattice degradation already at 40%. Blood pH dropping every 4 minutes. There is no sequence of interventions that our models give better than 0 probability of success. He paused. The kindest thing is to make him comfortable. Prex said nothing. She kept adjusting the fluid line. It was at this point that Ray Colton walked in. He was the human. There was only one aboard the Serathon, which was still something of an experiment. A crew exchange program between the Galactic Medical Council and the small, but increasingly present human medical community. Ray had been on board for 6 months. He was a field trauma surgeon from a place on Earth called Port Alden, where the hospital had 17 beds and power cuts twice a week. He was not tall. He was not impressive to look at. He had a habit of drinking cold coffee and asking questions that the other crew members found either interesting or irritating, depending on their mood. He looked at Dean on the table. He looked at the data wall. He looked at Sorvin. "What happened?" he asked. Sorvin told him. Briefly, efficiently. Then he added, "It is beyond treatment. We are moving to comfort protocol." Ray walked to the data wall and looked at it for a long time without speaking. He tilted his head slightly to the left, the way he did when he was thinking hard. Prex watched him from across the table. Galt had already begun filling out the paperwork. "His organ clusters are failing in sequence," Ray said. It was not a question. "Yes," said Sorvin. "And in neural lattice degradation. It started after the organ failures, not before." Sorvin paused. "Correct. So the lattice isn't the primary problem. It's reacting to the pressure collapse in the clusters. That is an accurate description of what is happening. Yes. It does not change the outcome." Ray turned away from the wall. "I've seen something like this before," he said. "Not in a Theran. In humans. Blunt force trauma, multiple organ compartments, cascading failure." He spoke carefully, choosing each word. "We have a technique. It's called staged pressure redistribution. Instead of trying to fix everything at once, which never works because each intervention creates pressure spikes that damage the others, you sequence the decompressions manually. You stabilize one cluster, let it settle, then move to the next." There was a short silence. Sorvin said, "That technique is not in any Theran medical literature." "No," Ray agreed, "because no one has tried it on a Theran." Galt looked up from his paperwork. "The biology is entirely different." "The biology is different," Ray said. "The physics isn't. Pressure is pressure. Cascade failure is cascade failure. The mechanism is the same, even if the parts are different." Another silence. Longer this time. Sorvin studied Ray with the careful, neutral expression he used when he was taking something seriously without wanting to show it. "Our models give your approach a very low probability of success." "What does your model give comfort protocol?" Ray asked. Sorvin did not answer because the answer was 0, and they both knew it. "Then I'm asking for a chance," Ray said. "I'm not asking for approval or resources or a team. Just time. Give me 90 minutes, and I'll take full responsibility for the outcome either way. Prex looked at Sorvin. Sorvin looked at Ray. Then he looked at Dean on the table. Small, still, all 6 eyes closed, his breathing shallow and getting worse. 90 minutes, Sorvin said. And I want Prex with you. Galt went back to his paperwork. He did not believe anything would change. Sorvin left the bay without another word. He told himself he was granting the request as a professional courtesy. Nothing more. He did not let himself think about the small, stubborn voice in the back of his mind that wondered, just for a moment, if the human might actually know something they did not. Ray was already pulling on his gloves. Prex had assisted in hundreds of procedures. She had handed tools to some of the finest surgeons in the known galaxy. She had stayed calm through bleeds, through equipment failures, through cases so complicated that even the senior staff had needed a moment to breathe. She was not easily unsettled. But watching Ray Colton pull components from the ship's repair bay and carry them into the medical bay in a metal tray, that unsettled her a little. "Those are pressure cuffs," she said. "From a hull maintenance kit." "Modified pressure cuffs," Ray said. He set the tray down and began adjusting the tension valves on each one with a small tool from his personal kit. "The medical versions are calibrated for Veldari or Kothi physiology. These I can set manually. More control." Prex looked at the cuffs, then at Ray. "You have done this before?" "Not on a Theron." He did not look up for what he was doing. "But the principle holds." She handed him a sterile cloth without being asked. He used it without pausing. They were already falling into a rhythm, which was something she noted and filed away. "Where did you learn this technique?" she asked. Ray was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My grandfather was a doctor. Small town, almost no equipment, patients coming in from farm accidents and mine collapses. He couldn't wait for the right tools. He used what was there. He checked the calibration on the 3rd cuff. He told me once, the body wants to survive. Your job is just to stop it from getting in its own way." Prex considered this. Her own training had been long and careful, full of protocols and peer-reviewed methods and layers of approval. The idea of a doctor improvising with farm equipment in a small building on a primitive planet, she would have called it dangerous before today. Now she was not sure what to call it. "Sorvin ran the simulations," she said quietly. 400 of them. Every result was the same. "I know. He is not a careless doctor. He is the best I have ever worked with." "I believe you," Ray said. He looked up then, and his expression was not arrogant or dismissive. It was something simpler than that. "But simulations are built from what has been tried before. This hasn't been tried before, so the model doesn't know what to do with it." He picked up the tray. "That doesn't mean it won't work. It means the model has no data." She followed him back into the treatment bay. Dean's readings were worse. His breathing had changed, shorter, more uneven. The data wall showed the 2nd organ cluster beginning to drop. They had less time than expected. Ray looked at the readings without panic. He placed the 1st cuff around the base of the uppermost organ cluster and set the pressure manually. Low, careful, just enough to slow the collapse without triggering a spike in the others. Then he stepped back and watched the monitor. Prex watched too. For 30 seconds, nothing changed. Then the pressure reading in the 1st cluster leveled out. Not recovered. Just stopped falling. IT was a small thing. A very small thing. But Prex felt it land in her chest like something solid. "First one is holding," she said. "For now." Ray moved to the 2nd cluster. "The hard part is the timing. If I move too fast, I create a pressure wave that collapses the one I just stabilized. If I move too slow, the 3rd cluster fails before I get to it." He set the 2nd cuff. "I need you to watch the 1st cluster and tell me the moment it shifts. Even a small shift." "Understood." He began working. She began watching. The room was quiet except for the soft sounds of the equipment and Dean's uneven breathing. After several minutes, Prex said, "First cluster is stable." "Good." Ray's hands moved to the 2nd cuff and began fine-tuning the pressure. "Talk to me about Theron biology. What do you know about how their clusters communicate with each other?" She told him everything she knew. He listened without interrupting, asking a short question here and there. Not testing her, she realized, but genuinely building a picture in real time. He was not working from a memorized plan. He was thinking as he went, adjusting the picture every time she gave him new information. That IT struck her then, with some force, that this was not a different version of the medicine she knew. It was a different kind of medicine entirely. Hers was built on accumulated knowledge. His was built on the ability to think under pressure, with whatever was available, in conditions that did not wait for the right answer. She found she could not decide which was better. She suspected the honest answer was that you needed both. Second cluster, Ray said. What's the reading? She checked. Pressure is rising slightly. Still in manageable range. Good. That's what we want. He exhaled slowly. Okay, one more to go. From the doorway, and neither of them had heard him enter, Sorvin stood and watched. He said nothing. He did not come closer. He simply stood there with his arms at his sides, and his expression completely unreadable. Ray did not notice him. He was already moving to the third cuff. Prex noticed. She said nothing either. She just turned back to the monitor and kept watching the numbers, willing them, in whatever small way a person could will such things, to keep moving in the right direction. The clock on the data wall read 61 minutes remaining when things began to go wrong. Ray had the first 2 organ clusters holding. It was not a full recovery, not even close, but they were stable, and stability was the first step. He had moved to the third cluster, the worst of the 3, and placed his final cuff. The pressure reading had dipped, then leveled, then dipped again. Every time he corrected it, something else shifted. Theron biology he was learning did not like being told what to do. First cluster is showing microfluctuations, Prex said. Her voice was steady. She had been steady the entire time, and Ray was grateful for it in the way you are grateful for solid ground. How much? Small. Not dangerous yet. Yet, Ray said. Yet, she confirmed. He kept working on the third cluster. The problem was the connective tissue between the second and third. In humans, there would have been a clear boundary. In Theron physiology, the two bled into each other at the edges, sharing pressure pathways that had no exact equivalent in human anatomy. Every adjustment he made to the third sent a small ripple back into the second. He was playing with water in a closed container. Push on one wall, and the other walls feel it. Then the neural lattice spiked. The alarm was not loud. The Serathon's medical bay used soft tones instead of sharp ones, a design choice Ray had initially found irritating and now appreciated greatly. But even a soft tone at the wrong moment is the wrong thing. Neural lattice at 63% degradation, Prex said. Rising. Ray looked at the reading. The lattice was not his primary target. He had been hoping it would stabilize on its own once the organ clusters stopped collapsing. It had not. It was reacting to the pressure changes he was making, interpreting his interventions as additional trauma. In human medicine, the response to neural spike during surgery was sedation and pause. Wait and observe. Let the nervous system settle. He did not have time to wait. He reached for the small folded membrane pad he had placed at the edge of the tray earlier. He had brought it without being entirely sure he would need it, which was a habit his grandfather had drilled into him. Always bring one more thing. He pressed the pad firmly against a raised node on the left side of Dean's thorax, just below the lattice's primary junction point. Prex stared. What is that? Spinal compression technique. Human version. We use it when the nervous system is misfiring during trauma. Physical pressure at the right point can interrupt the feedback loop. He held the pad steady with one hand and continued working the third cuff with the other. It looks like nothing. It works. Prex looked at the data wall. The lattice reading slowed. Still degrading, but slower. It is working, she said, and the quiet surprise in her voice was not an insult. It was honest. It usually does, Ray said. 40 minutes left. Stay with me. The next 20 minutes were the longest of the procedure. Ray moved between the 3 cluster cuffs in a careful sequence, adjusting pressure in small amounts, reading the ripple effect, adjusting again. Prex called out numbers without being asked, anticipating what he needed to hear. Sorvin had not moved from the doorway. Ray was aware of him in the peripheral way you are aware of weather, present, significant, not something you can control. The 40-minute mark. The third cluster pressure began to hold that IT was fragile. It was inconsistent, but the free fall had stopped. And then, the complication he had been dreading, the third cluster began pulling pressure from a second. Not a malfunction, not a new injury, just Theron biology doing what it naturally did. The weaker system drawing resources from the stronger one, a survival reflex built into the species that no one had warned him about, because no one had ever gotten this far into the procedure to see it happen. In 20 minutes, the third cluster would stabilize, and the second would crash. Ray stood very still for a moment. Then he made the decision that he reached to the second cluster's cuff and dialed the pressure down. Not off, just reduced. Enough to let the third cluster take what it needed. Enough to stop the tug of war. It was a controlled sacrifice. Let the second cluster run lean while the third found its footing, then bring the second back up before it fell to IT was not in any protocol. It was barely in any theory. IT was the thing his grandfather had called field judgment, which was a polite name for making the best choice available when all the choices were bad. Second cluster is dropping, Prex said. She heard her own voice tighten slightly and controlled it. I know, Ray said. Let it drop. I'm watching the floor. She looked at him. If it drops below threshold, I'll bring it back before it does. He kept his eyes on the monitor. Trust the process. She did not know his process. She had known him for 6 months, and she still did not fully understand the way his mind moved through a crisis. Not panicking, not detached, but somewhere in between, like a person walking a narrow path very fast in the dark. But she had seen the first cluster hold. She had seen the lattice slow. She had watched him pull tools from a repair bay and do something that 400 simulations said was impossible to She watched the number drop, and she said nothing, and she trusted. The monitor flatlined for 3 seconds in O-tone. No alarm. Just silence and a flat line and the sound of Prex not breathing. Then a beat. Faint. Uneven. Real. Then another. Ray exhaled through his nose. He brought the second cuff pressure back up, slow and steady, following the beat like a guide rope. The line on the monitor stopped being flat and started being a wave again. He stepped back from the table. His hands were steady. His face was tired. All 3 clusters holding, Prex said. Her voice was not quite steady anymore, and she did not try to fix it. From the doorway, Sorvin said nothing, but he did not leave. Dean woke up 12 hours later. IT was not a dramatic waking. There was no sudden movement, no sharp intake of breath, no moment of wide-eyed confusion. He simply became present in the room, the way a tide comes in, gradually, then fully. One eye opened, then another, then a third. He looked at the ceiling of the recovery pod for a long time. Then he looked at Prex, who was sitting beside him filling out chart notes, and he said, in the slow, translated speech of someone still working through sedation, "Am I dead?" Prex said no. He looked at the ceiling again. "The asteroid," he said. "Yes, you were in a collision. You have been here for 14 hours. A long pause. I remember the impact. Then nothing. That is fine," she said. "Nothing is fine to remember." He accepted this. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Why am I not dead?" Prex smiled, a small, careful expression that she usually kept for patients who had just said something that deserved it. "That," she said, "is a good question." Sorvin's office was small and very tidy. He kept it that way because he found disorder difficult to think inside. There were no personal items on the desk, no decorations on the walls. Just a data pad, a chair across from his, and a faint blue light from the window that showed the slow turn of stars outside. Ray sat in the chair. He was on his 3rd cup of cold coffee, which Sorvin had stopped finding strange about him 2 months ago. "I ran your procedure through the simulation model," Sorvin said. Ray waited. "After the fact, once I knew the outcome and could include the specific variables you worked with." Sorvin folded his hands on the desk. The model gave it a 6% chance of success. Ray nodded slowly. "That's higher than I expected. Honestly, most surgeons would not attempt a procedure with a 6% success rate. Most surgeons had better options," Ray said. Sorvin was quiet for a moment. "I want to understand something. Not clinically, as a matter of philosophy." He chose his next words with care. "You knew the probability was very low. You knew the procedure had never been attempted on a Theron. You knew that if it failed, the patient's final hours would be less peaceful than comfort protocol would have allowed." He paused. "How did you decide to proceed?" Ray turned the cup in his hands. Because a 6% chance beats a 0% one, he said. And because comfort protocol wasn't a kindness in that situation. It was just a way of making the people in the room feel better about giving up. He was not harsh when he said it, just direct. I've worked in places where giving up wasn't an option. Not because we were brave, because there was no one else. You get comfortable with bad odds when you've never had the luxury of good ones. Sorvin absorbed this. He was a careful thinker, and what he was thinking now was complicated. Not a disagreement, exactly, but an encounter with an idea that had no place in the structure of his training. His entire medical philosophy was built on optimization, on finding the best path, on not attempting what the data said would fail. And yet here was a man who had walked directly into a 6% chance and come out the other side with a living patient. My training would call your approach reckless, Sorvin said. My grandfather would call your approach comfortable, Ray replied. Another silence. This one was not uncomfortable. It was two people sitting with a thought that was too large to fit neatly anywhere. Ray went to see Dean that evening. Dean had been told by that point what had happened. He had listened to Prex's account with all 6 eyes open and very still. When she finished, he had asked one question. What species was the medic who saved him? She told him that he had never met a human in person before. He knew about them. Most people in the galaxy knew about them at this point, in a distant, vague sort of way, the way you know about weather patterns in places you have never been. Small, short-lived, surprisingly loud, present everywhere, suddenly, all at once, as if they had been waiting for someone to open a door. When Ray walked into the recovery pod, Dean looked at him with all 6 eyes and did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, "You are very small to have done that." Ray laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that surprised even the person making it. It was the first time anyone on the ship had heard it, and the sound of it made Prex look up from the doorway, where she was pretending not to listen. "Yeah," Ray said, pulling a chair close to the pod. "We get that a lot." Dean watched him settle in. Then, slowly, carefully, with the deliberate grace of someone who is still learning how much of himself still worked, he reached out one segmented limb. Ray held out his hand. They were a study in differences, the hard, layered surface of Dean's limb against the soft, plain skin of a human hand. 2 bodies that had no business being in the same story, touching across everything that separated them. Dean held the contact for a moment. Then he let go. "Thank you," he said. The translator made the words flat, but the voice underneath them was not. The story got out the way things always get out on a ship. Not through any announcement, but through the quiet, unstoppable movement of people talking to other people in corridors and meal halls and break rooms. By the second day after Dean's recovery, every crew member on the Serathon knew what had happened. By the 3rd day, most of them had found a reason to walk past the medical bay. They did not come in. They were not that obvious. They simply appeared near the entrance at various points during the day, adjusted something, checked something, moved on. Prex noticed. She said nothing. She thought it was the kindest kind of attention, the kind that asks nothing. Ray, for his part, behaved as if nothing significant had happened. He did his rounds. He drank cold coffee. He asked questions about whatever biological system he did not fully understand yet, which was still a long list, and he wrote notes in a small pad that he kept in his coat pocket. Several crew members had asked him about the procedure. He answered all of them honestly and without performance that on the 4th day, a young Kothi medical student named Voss came to find him. Voss was 18 months into his training, quiet in the way of people who were paying very close attention to everything around them. He sat across from Ray in the small side room off the medical bay and placed a data pad on the table between them. "I want to understand the decision process," Voss said. "Not the technique, the thinking." Ray leaned back. "What do you want to know? How did you see a solution that the rest of us missed?" Ray was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm not sure I saw it first. I think the difference is that I was willing to try it first." He turned the cold cup in his hands. "Where I trained, we had one surgical suite for a region covering thousands of people. No specialist backup. No second opinion most of the time. You learn very fast to work with what you have, because waiting for the right conditions means people die while you wait." Voss nodded, listening carefully. Human medicine has a long history of being built in bad conditions. Ray continued. Wars, famines, isolated communities, doctors working in the field with basic tools. That history is full of techniques that were invented because someone needed an answer right now and had to build one out of whatever was available. He paused. Those techniques are still in our training. We still learn them, not because the conditions are the same, but because the thinking behind them is useful. The habit of improvising, the comfort with uncertainty. Voss was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that stopped Ray. You developed your medicine in conditions of scarcity. We developed ours in conditions of abundance. He said it slowly, as if reading something he was finding for the first time. That is why yours bends and ours breaks. Ray looked at the young student for a moment. Write that down, he said. I already did, Voss said. Sorvin submitted his report to the Galactic Medical Council 8 days after Dean's recovery. He wrote it 3 times. The first version was too cold, factual without context. The second was too long. The third was exactly what it needed to be. A clear account of what had happened, a precise description of the technique used, and a formal recommendation that human field trauma methodology be studied for possible integration into cross-species emergency protocols. It was the first such recommendation for a non-council species in 200 years. Prex read it over his shoulder before he sent it. She said, he will not know what to do with this. No, Sorvin agreed. He sent it anyway. Ray found out from Prex the following morning. He was in the middle of his rounds, and she told him in the same tone she used to relay patient updates, which was her way of keeping things from becoming more dramatic than they needed to be. Ray stopped walking. He stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at nothing. He stopped. Started again. That's a significant thing. Yes. I don't know what to say. You do not need to say anything, Prex told him. It is Sorvin's report. He says what he observed. Ray started walking again. After a few steps, he said, the techniques I used, I didn't invent any of them. They came from other doctors. Older doctors. People who practiced in conditions I can barely imagine. He paused. The real knowledge isn't with me. It's back on Earth, in the hands of thousands of people who have never left their own regions. Field surgeons, rural doctors, village medics working out of single rooms with whatever they have. Prex considered this. Then the council's study will need to reach them. That's a big project. Perhaps, she said. They reached the end of the corridor. Outside the window, the stars sat in their permanent, unhurried positions, indifferent to the small and important things happening in the ship drifting among them. But it begins with one report. Ray looked out the window for a moment. My grandfather would have found this very funny, he said. Why? Because he spent his whole life thinking he was just keeping up. Ray turned back toward the bay. He had no idea he was building something. 3 weeks after the asteroid collision, Dean was cleared to go home, but he did not leave right away. He asked for one more day, and then another, and by the time the transport was actually scheduled, he had filled most of his recovery hours sitting up in the pod with a data pad, reading about Earth that he read about the continents and the oceans. He read about the long, complicated history of human conflict and survival. He read about hospitals built in the middle of war zones, and doctors who crossed dangerous terrain on foot to reach patients, and the quiet, steady work of people who had decided that other people's lives were worth the trouble. He read for a long time. Then he asked Prex to bring him more. She brought what she could find. She sat with him sometimes, answering questions he had about things he did not understand. Human social structures, the concept of nations, the way humans had spent centuries being their own worst enemies, and then, somehow, kept going anyway. They are very contradictory, Dean said once. Yes, Prex agreed. Contradictory and very stubborn. Also yes. Dean thought about this. I think, he said carefully, those might be the same thing. Ray came to say goodbye on the morning of the departure. He brought nothing. He did not think Dean needed a gift, and he had not been able to think of one that fit. So he arrived with just himself and his coat and his hands in his pockets, the way he arrived everywhere. The departure bay was on the lower deck. It was not a large space, and it should have been empty except for the transport crew and Dean and whoever was seeing him off. Instead, when Ray got there, it was full, not crowded, the Serathon was not a large vessel. But every crew member who could find a reason to be off-duty had found one. They stood in small groups along the walls. Sorvin stood near the transport door, straight and formal as always, but present. Prex was beside him. Voss was in the back, near the doorway, with his datapad held against his chest. Dean came in from the recovery wing walking under his own power, which was still a careful and deliberate kind of walking, but walking. All 6 eyes moved around the room. He seemed surprised by the number of people, and then he seemed to understand, in the way you understand something that does not need to be explained. Sorvin spoke first. He had a formal manner that suited moments like this. He did not make them larger than they were, but he gave them the weight they deserved. He told Dean that the Serathon's medical log had been updated with a full record of his case, that the record would be submitted to the Council archives, and that it would carry Dean's name. Then Sorvin turned to Ray. "The log includes a notation," he said. He read it aloud from the datapad, in the same even voice he used for everything. Non-standard technique. Outcome, survival. Recommended for review. He lowered the pad. "It is the closest thing our tradition has to an honor. It is meant sincerely." Ray nodded once. He did not look away, and he did not make it smaller than it was. Prex stepped forward next. She held out a small carved piece of pale stone, smooth, shaped into a rough oval with a single mark pressed into its center. A Kathi symbol. She placed it in Ray's hand. "It means the one who stays when others step back," she said. Ray looked at it for a moment. Then he closed his hand around it. Dean stood at the edge of all this, watching. When it was his turn, he moved to Ray and stood close, closer than most species stood to each other in formal settings, which was a Theran way of saying something that the translator would not fully carry. "Among my people," Dean said, "the one who saves a life becomes responsible for it. They're bound to each other, the saved and the one who saved." He paused. "I know humans do not follow this custom, but I will follow it for you, wherever I am in the galaxy. Whatever I have, if you need it, it is yours." The room was quiet. Ray said, "You don't have to do that." "I know," Dean said. "That is not why I'm doing it." Ray looked at him. This strange, quiet, 6-eyed person who had arrived as a body on a table 3 weeks ago and was now standing on his own feet, making promises across species lines. He nodded once, and Dean nodded back, and that was enough. Dean boarded the transport. The doors closed. The departure process was efficient and, in the way of all departures, slightly too fast. Ray stood beside Prex and watched the transport window as it moved toward the launch corridor. "I just did what any doctor would do," he said. It was not quite an argument, more like a thought he had been carrying and needed to put down somewhere. Prex tilted her head. "No," she said. "You did what only a human would do. Any doctor could have learned the technique, perhaps. But not every doctor would have stood in that room, looked at a case every model called hopeless, and decided that the model was the problem and not the patient." She paused. "That is not medicine. That is something else." "What is it?" She thought about it honestly. "Stubbornness," she said, "but the useful kind." Ray smiled. Outside the wide window at the end of the bay, the transport had cleared the dock and was moving into open space. In a few minutes, it would jump, and Dean would be on his way home. Ray looked at the stars, not just the ones in front of him, but the general idea of all of them. The vast, cold, full distance of the galaxy, and all the ships moving through it, and all the people on those ships who would one day end up on a table somewhere needing someone stubborn enough to stay in the room. He thought about his grandfather in the small hospital in Port Alden, fixing people with whatever was at hand, never knowing the long reach of the habit he was passing on. He thought about Voss. In the back of the departure bay, writing things down. He put his hand in his coat pocket. The carved stone was still there, smooth and cool and real. For the first time since leaving Earth, Ray Colton felt completely, simply at home.